mother told them that this was the soul of a little devil that died when he was less than a month old. The spirit was usually very naughty and would get in trouble. My mother said that the little demon was created from a dead child, and it would go around at night looking for targets to harm. It would go to find a house with babies to disturb, and it was crying of the baby that lured the little devil into the house. The little devil seemed to have smelled something because he heard the cry, and he began to climb into the yard. It waited for the child to fall asleep, and when the child's parents were also asleep, he would sneak into the house. It would start climbing into the house. It crept up to the side of my sister's couple and my nephew's bed. Maybe it was trying to harm my nephew. The little devil bit the child's limbs to suck his blood. That thing was also the reason why my nephew was scared and cried all night. The little devil's teeth were sharp and thin. The wound was like a rash. Children who cried for no reason at all were bitten by the little devil's tormented. And the adults couldn't see it because it was just a wandering child ghost. My sister was so scared that she cried and asked my mother what they should do, because if they didn't do anything, the little devil would come every night to harm their son. My mother said the devil was most afraid of lanterns. She asked my brother-in-law to buy 2 red lanterns for the night. They should follow, and it would be fine in a few days. My sister's couple all lit the lanterns in the morning and the evening because they were afraid that the little devil would come to their house if they were careless. At night, my sister's house glowed red, like the house in a horror movie. The lanterns seemed to work well. The grandson, my nephew, didn't cry that night. He slept with a very peaceful face. The whole family hoped that he would sleep well that night. On the contrary, my sister and brother-in-law always kept an eye on everything at the house. They wanted to see if the little devil was hiding or not. The couple always looked around all night and did not dare to sleep for fear of where the little devil would crawl out. Fortunately, nothing out of the ordinary happened, so the whole family spent a good and peaceful night under the red light of the lantern. The lantern was lit for 3 days in a row. The baby stopped crying, and since then, my sister taught everyone to use this method whenever they heard of a little devil that would come to disturb their families and young children at night. This story happened in our house, and my mom was the one to experience it. At that time, a new road was being built next to us, and construction was right outside our windows. Those days, my father was on a business trip, and I was not at home, just my mother and Hannah. Hannah was the name of our husky dog. In the countryside, people often went to bed early after having dinner. As usual, my mother entered the room and quickly fell asleep at night. However, my mother suddenly heard Hannah barking in the living room in the middle of the night. The dog was usually very good, but for some reason that day, Hannah was a bit naughty. My mother couldn't sleep when she heard Hannah howling, so she howled 2 or 3 times. "Hannah, shut up! I need to sleep!" At that time, my mother was angry. Hannah didn't usually bark at night, and my mother would get a good sleep. Sometimes she barked once or twice, but very seldomly. But that night, she kept barking all night long. My mother was so upset that she climbed out of bed, put on her shoes, and went to the kitchen to see what was wrong with Hannah. My mother quickly pushed open the door to see what was happening. "Hannah, what the hell are you doing? Do you know I'm sleeping?" My mother scolded. My mother heard that Hannah was still barking, even though she held her. Hannah looked towards the main door and continued to bark loudly as if she had seen something. It looked like Hannah would continue to bark all night long. At this moment, she looked like she was scared of something, because her eyes kept moving towards the door and the dark specks in front of it. My mother glanced at the door and was confused. There seemed to be nothing suspicious there. All was normal inside. The kitchen door was closed. At first, my mom thought someone had broken in, but that couldn't be because the door didn't move at all. And my mother often had a habit of cleaning the kitchen floor at night. She was afraid that if she went to the kitchen when she was thirsty, she must have fallen. That's why she was extra careful. After that, my mother left the door open to let the air in and ventilate the floor to dry. In the evening, all electrical appliances would be turned off in case of the event of a short circuit. She was alone, you know. My mother also remembered well that the kitchen door was open before she went to bed. But there seemed to be something out of the ordinary here. But my mother didn't think much of it. She just thought the strong wind made the door close and Hannah startled, so it barked loudly. Hannah turned to look at my mother as if she wanted to say something, but my mother still didn't care and assumed that Hannah must have trouble sleeping. My mother got a little angry and didn't want to care about it anymore. She turned to go in and wanted to go back to her room. She must have been very tired after a long day. Hannah ran up to my mother again and continued to bark. She had never been like this before. Perhaps she had a premonition that something was about to happen. My mother didn't know why Hannah was so upset that night. She didn't seem to want to listen to my mother's commands. What? How are you, Hannah? Is something wrong? Are you hungry, baby? As soon as my mother stopped Hannah, continued to bark into the kitchen. It was not because of the thief breaking in, nor was it because Hannah was hungry. Why must she not? My mother suddenly realized that there might be something that made Hannah feel danger. It sniffed something. Mother decided to inspect the kitchen. She stepped cautiously closer to the kitchen door. She was afraid if someone or a thief tried to break in. Fortunately, he had a weapon. She wouldn't know what to do. My mother carefully pressed the doorknob several times. She was scared, nervous, and worried because if the door opened, never knew what would happen. But when she opened the door suddenly seemed stuck and could not open again. My mother wondered if someone had intentionally locked the door inside. When she suspected something was wrong, she suddenly stopped because she heard the sound of broken dishes in the kitchen. My mother got scared and backed away. In fact, this was extremely dangerous because if thieves were in the house, my mother would have no way to fight them. She quickly went back into the bedroom, locked the door and called 110 for help from the police. She carefully locked the door tightly and waited in the room for a while. She also listened to see if there was anything unusual outside. She just stared through the open door until the police came. My mother opened the door for the police to come in. Hannah did not bark like this before. Two police officers quickly went to check the kitchen. Since the kitchen door didn't lock, they only needed to push it lightly to open it. Two very cautious policemen entered to investigate. My mother standing next to me was equally nervous, but there was no thief in there. Police also didn't find any traces of opening the door or breaking in. The scene was just a little messy in the kitchen. All kinds of furniture was strewn all over the place as if someone had broken into the house. But obviously this reason couldn't be because there was no sign of a thief entering the house at all. And the floor was full of sticky things like grease. The side of the fridge was opened by someone. Couldn't close. Food and fruit were all over the ground. The two policemen did not know what it was, but they ruled out the possibility of someone entering the door because they did not find any tools used to break the door down. The only way to enter was the window to the kitchen, but the window had a carefully guarded latch, and there was no sign of vandalism. Something slipped through the gap in the iron railing, but it certainly wasn't a person, and the police suspected that wild cats or wild animals might have came in to find food. After determining there was no danger, the police left. My mother said the stains on the floor just then did not come off. They smelled bad. The following day after that incident, the road behind my house was being repaired. People dug up something. They flocked to see a lot, and my mother was also there. My mother had just come back from the market at the time. She saw people gathering to see something, so she joined them. She ran over and asked the man standing nearby to inquire about what was happening. The man said they were digging a coffin up. Something went wrong, so the coffin was dug over. The two men also brought out something wrapped in a cotton blanket. The cotton blanket had dripped back drops of water. This water stained seemed new, so it had not yet dried but dripped down. After looking at the drippings like oil, this liquid was black and gave off an extremely unpleasant stench that made everyone want to vomit. My mother's heart suddenly began to beat faster, for she remembered the strain of the oil on the kitchen floor last night. Exactly like these black liquid stains. Later, the post-mortem department came to examine the body and said that it was only a dead person that was buried here and the road was successfully repaired. My mother asked someone to hang a bag wander around the window facing the street. She said it would ward off evil spirits. After that, everything was okay. This happened to a friend of my dad's when he was a kid, and maybe for my dad, this was a part of a very horrifying memory. That friend's name was Lindo. Very talented and powerful in class because Lindo fully met the standards of a very good student. And he stood out the most, especially in sport. Almost everything about Lindo's strength training, he got the maximum results from it. There was sports festival or something. As long as he competed, he'd win first prize. In the sports world, Lindo seemed to have no rival. He was always the first to finish. No one could surpass Lindo. He was so strong on the track like a beast. Lindo was like the school idol. Everyone at school admired him, saw him as an idol, and everyone wanted to play with him. Until bad things started to happen to him. He had a strange disease, and this disease seemed to have stolen everything from him. Lindo spent several days in the hospital. He looked so pale, emaciated. He had a tired look on his face. Lindo would probably stop playing sports for a while. My dad went to visit him. Everyone was very worried about him and his condition, and everyone was hoping that he would return to school soon. My dad said he didn't know what kind of illness Lindo had, but he kept looking at my dad like he didn't know him. He gave my dad a look with black eyes that made him very sad. Then, when we heard that he was discharged from the hospital, my father came to visit him again. Because the two of them were very close to each other, they saw each other as close brothers, like a family. After being discharged from the hospital, he did not go to school, nor did he leave the house. He seemed to turn into a completely different person. When my dad visited him that day, Lindo was eating, but if he was just eating normally, there was nothing to talk about. Witnessing that scene, my father panicked. He was eating eggs, but the way of eating was very strange. Lindo didn't peel the egg. He didn't peel out the outer shell, and he immediately took the egg and shoved it into his mouth with shell and all. My father was really surprised. My dad didn't see Lindo chewing, but he was putting the egg straight into his mouth and swallowing it, and it was worse when it was a raw egg. His mother said that since being discharged from the hospital until now, he has not chewed anything but swallowed it whole, and especially raw eggs. The craving for raw eggs was getting worse. My dad sat next to me, but Lindo did not care or say anything. He ate 4 or 5 eggs at a time, absolutely raw. No one dared to play with him after Lindo got that strange disease. which made his mother very sad. After a long time, Linda also gradually stabilized. He also looked fresher. Sometimes he even walked around the house with my father. But of course, another strange thing happened to Lindo, a sight that my father witnessed and which my father said he is still scared of to this day. When the weather was in late spring and early autumn, the gentle wind blew, bringing cool water vapor, and the leaves also began to fall, creating a charming landscape. But something wasn't right here. It was not the leaves falling on my father's shoulders, but the patches of skin falling from Lindo. What had just happened in front of his eyes made him extremely confused because Lindo looked very scary and a little disgusting. At first, my father thought it was paper on the road that was blown away by the wind, but it turned out to be pieces of skin peeling off from Lindo's body, not only on the neck, on the back of the neck, but all over Lindo's body, especially the face. Patches of human skin began to emerge and fall off. Lindo didn't even show any fear. He even tore the peeling skin off his entire arm like he was changing skin. After peeling the skin off of himself, he would hold the skin and play with it like a game, and this scared my dad to death. But something unexpected was happening to his skin, while it was still intact after tearing off another layer of skin. Looking at him, he was happy and without fear. People in the village said that perhaps Lindo had some sort of skin disease. As long as he ate snake meat, he would recover because this was a folk remedy that everyone knew. Lindo's mother asked a young man in the neighborhood who often caught snakes to sell to everyone in the village, and his mother asked for some snake meat to bring it home. But inexplicably, when he saw the plate of meat, Lindo froze when he saw each piece of snake smoking. He was still eating raw eggs. He suddenly changed his face. He looked panicked, and he immediately shoved the plate of snake meat away with his hand. He had no control over his emotions or behavior. He screamed loudly, and he then smashed everything like a crazy man, looking angry and wild. He was still not satisfied, so he went to the young snake catcher's house. Lindo's insults and curses were extremely malicious. He kept emitting obscenities. He cursed the young man to death. Although Lindo's temperament changed, my father often played with him whenever he had time, and sometimes he also chatted with my father. By the time they were 15 or 16, Lindo's body had grown, and his hair started to grow a lot, but Lindo didn't like it. Once when we were sitting and talking on the straw in front of the house, suddenly my father saw that Lindo was holding a pair of pliers. He said it was great to pull out the leg hairs with pliers, but the special thing was that he didn't feel any pain, but enjoyed it very much. Just when he was especially sober, Lindo said something to my dad. His words shocked my dad. "There's a snake living inside of me." Lindo began to remember and recount things that had happened to him. He said the other day when Lindo was on his way home alone, he heard rustling in the grass across the street, which attracted him. It turned out that the sound was from a green snake. He was lying in the grass and leaving its body outside. The snake was also quite big. Lindo couldn't even know what was on his mind at that time. He just knew that when he saw the snake, he felt very interested and excited for some reason. But a crazy thought popped into Lindo's head. Rather, this was a cruel thought. Lindo quickly raised his foot and trampled the snake to death. After that, Lindo said that he went home and strange things started happening that night. He slept and had a dream about a snake. Maybe it was because he killed it and then he had a nightmare. He saw a particularly large snake, or rather giant snake, that had entered his body for shelter. Lindo's family also suspected that he was possessed by some sort of snake demon, so they invited an exorcist to help him drive away the snake ghost, but to no avail. Lindo died before he was 40 years old, and every time my father came home, he would go to the village cemetery to visit his friend's grave. My father once asked his classmate about this. He said that maybe because Lindo killed the snake, it might have brought revenge on him because snakes were inherently sacred. Lindo Linda must have been bitten by a snake and it had possessed his soul. Now that's what retribution. But Linda had no way out. She was like a sister to me, and her name was Aki. Suddenly, one day she asked to take a week off because she was not feeling well. When I visited her, she told me a scary story that affected her really. A close friend from her hometown named Yuko loved the guy in town. However, they broke up as soon as she announced she was pregnant. Because of this pregnancy, Yuko got a bad reputation in the village, so Aki returned to her hometown and invited Yuko to the city to live with her. Aki comforted Yuko that she didn't need to stay in a place that caused her so much sadness. The apartment that Aki rented was also quite spacious. It was sad to be alone. When Aki lived with Yuko, he could definitely Yuko fun. Stepping inside the apartment was clean and comfortable. The apartment space also made Yuko feel more comfortable. Aki said that the owner of the apartment was her cousin. They had just moved to the US, so they rented this place for her. This area was safe. Recently, a hotel had just posted a job advertisement. Aki said that they would take Yuko to the hotel to register for work. And so, the following day, the two started a new life in the new apartment. That night, Yuko came home late from work. She walked home alone. The air around was also quite cold. However, Yuko was also quite used to working late at night like that. She took heavy steps up the stairs. It was very late, so there was no one around. When this apartment had many other people living in it, it was quiet at night. Everything was so quiet that only Yuko's footsteps were heard. While Yuko was walking warily, she suddenly heard a voice calling from behind. Normally she wouldn't notice, but the voice was calling her name. She instinctively turned toward the source of the voice calling her name. However, the hallway was empty, and no one was behind her. This made Yuko feel scared. The call got closer and closer, and it caused her to panic. She began to tremble with fear from the increasing number of screens around her. As Yuko lifted her head to look up, a terrifying scene unfolded before her eyes that made her legs go numb. Right above her head was a woman floating in the air, looking downright terrifying. This woman was wearing a red dress. Her eyes were white, and she was a corpse. Yuko screamed in fear. It was the first time Yuko had seen such a terrifying floating corpse in her life. Yuko tried to run fast forward and opened the door to quickly run away and inside her apartment, but her eyes were still closed because of the terror. As soon as the door slammed shut, Yuko gasped for air. She still couldn't believe what she had just encountered. The ghost scared her to the point of turning pale. Aki saw Yuko's frightened expression and showed a surprise. Aki asked her what had happened. Yuko then stammered to say that she had met the ghost. It was a ghost in a red dress that was terrifying. Aki was surprised and asked if it was the red dress ghost. In the past, there were rumors of hanging ghosts in this apartment building, but it was just a rumor. Why was it true? To prove her point, Aki opened the door and looked outside, but there was absolutely nothing. Aki said that maybe because Yuko was tired from work and pregnant, she was just hallucinating. But then Yuko claimed to have seen was calling her name, calling her louder.
No.
At the moment, Hugo seemed to be dead. She felt a pair of legs hovering above her head. Hugo's face turned pale, trembling as she looked up at the source of the voice. She seemed to know what she was about to witness. However, something still urged her to try to raise her neck to look up. Horrible. The red-dressed ghost was on top of her head and looked at her with lifeless eyes. Hugo was so scared that she hugged her head and shouted. Immediately, Archie rushed to open the door and asked what had happened. At that moment, Hugo was shivering on the floor, looking terrified. She didn't understand why that ghost kept stalking her. Hugo burst into tears and told Archie what she had just witnessed. She assured Archie that it was not an illusion. It was a woman in a scary red dress. That night, for Hugo's peace of mind, Archie slept with her. Archie understood that perhaps due to psychological pressure, Hugo has psychological problems too. What a poor girl. The following morning, the apartment complex suddenly became noisy. Archie was woken up by the noise. She turned to see Hugo. It was no good. Archie thought Hugo must have woken up early to get ready for work. However, there was a scream coming from outside, followed by more frantic screams. Archie was startled, not understanding what was going on. She immediately ran outside and asked the people nearby what was going on. The man told her that someone had committed suicide. Right on the stairs, a woman in a red dress was hanged. Her long hair fell to cover the girl's face. When Archie saw the creepy scene before her eyes, she couldn't believe it. It was Hugo. What horrible news. Why was she hanging herself in a red dress? I comforted Archie and said that maybe Hugo was too stressed from pregnancy and the breakup with her boyfriend. So maybe she came up with that woman in the red dress. Because maybe she had been contemplating death for a long time. On the occasion of returning to my hometown to visit my family, that day I had an appointment with a close friend of my past to drink wine. While drunk, he told me about a terrifying true story that he had encountered. My friend's name was Jim. One day, his girlfriend suddenly broke up with him after 3 years of dating. Because he was so bored, he invited his colleagues out to sing and drink to relieve his sorrows. The company friends with Jim were passionate about singing. The lyrics seemed to cut into the heart of a person who was lovesick like Jim. However, Jim still sat there and was singing. Jim also didn't want his friends to know that he was dumped by his lover. But the more he thought about it, the more the lyrics cut into his wound. This heart has always been for you, but why did you say goodbye so harshly? A friend saw Jim singing sadly. He gave Jim the microphone and asked him to sing a song. He even joked, "Hey Jim, why do you look like you just got dumped, man? Cheer up. You want to sing a song?" As if he had been resentful for a long time, Jim felt like he was touched by pain. He burst into tears. It seemed that the alcohol had an effect on Jim and made him express his feelings. Jim cried loudly, so that his two friends were embarrassed for him. They tried to calm him down. That night, after releasing all his sadness through songs, Jim said goodbye to his two colleagues and left. The two friends also did not forget to comfort Jim. Everything would be fine. When sending two friends to the taxi, Jim also slowly walked home. His state of mind now turned terrible again. Jim and his girlfriend had been in love since they went to college together and shared a lecture hall. The two were attached for life, and they had a beautiful love that they shared with one another. However, after graduation and seeing that things changed, with many temptations in society that made their feelings different, Jim wasn't able to do anything else. While he was thinking about those years, Jim almost arrived at home. Suddenly, a girl passed by him, causing him to stop. The figure was familiar. He turned his head to look. The figure looked back. Was that his girlfriend? He looked quite surprised. Jim thought that maybe...
Ai, não acredito que você não viu aquela série. Tem que ver. A gente quer ver todos, né? Tem tanta coisa legal. Mas calma. Desde que você puder. Spoiler para 2024. Tem tempo para tudo.
His girlfriend went to his house to see him and wanted to come back with him. But because she couldn't find him at home, she returned. So just as he was about to chase the girl, he turned right. Jim paused for a few seconds and then decided to go after her. He ran to the end of the alley, but it was strange that the girl went so fast. There was only in the darkness in front of the alley. No girl. Without hesitation, Jim shouted his girlfriend's name and quickly chased after her. He was afraid of losing her again. Emotions running high, Jim tried to chase after in the hopes of catching up, telling her how much he loved her, how much he missed her. However, strangely enough, the more Jim chased after her, the more she was nowhere to be found. He did not know where she went. He looked around and wondered, where did she go? The place was a dead end. While thinking that maybe he was blindsided due to darkness, Jim suddenly saw a bowl in front of him. It was a large denomination bill. He paused for a moment with the idea of whether to pick it up or not. However, he didn't understand why he didn't want to pick up that bill. Something urged him to prioritize finding his girlfriend first. So he ignored the bill and went to him. He continued looking for his girlfriend. Suddenly a loud noise was heard right behind Jim. A glass door fell from above and the glass shattered, almost falling on him. He jumped forward in a panic. When he turned his head to look, his heart skipped a beat, as he just escaped an accident in an instant. The other window glass fell right on the bill's spot. If Jim had bent down to pick it up, the window would have fallen on him. Reflexively, Jim looked up to see which house was so careless. However, he discovered that this was an old apartment complex in the process of being cleared, and no people were living there. The weird thing appeared again. He turned pale. What the hell was going on? The fairy note that had turned into a piece of paper. It was a high denomination note just now, right? Even more terrifying, looking closely at it, Jim discovered that it had become the money of the underworld. Why was there money from the underworld here? He looked up again, this time even more worried. Where the window used to be, something or someone appeared to be looking down at him. The figure of a girl appeared moving. She was slowly moving. He realized it was a female ghost. Her body was covered in blood, her eyes were white, and she was looking at him with a scary expression. He was dumbfounded. This time he realized that he had encountered a ghost. He ran out of the alley as fast as possible. The following day, Jim went to inquire around and learned that just last week in this area, a girl was kidnapped by a pervert and brought to the apartment complex that was about to be cleared. The poor girl was raped and thrown down through the window. A funeral was held for her, and banknotes and bills were thrown to pay for her way to the underworld. This is a very mysterious story that I don't grandfather was very enthusiastic. He always hoped that he would be able to change the lives of poor children in the countryside with his knowledge. At that time, there was a child who didn't go to school for 2 days. My grandfather didn't know what was happening, but he was really worried about the child. He asked the child from the same village as their goal, and the student said that she was helping the fields at home. My grandfather shared a house with a villager. That night, when my grandfather sat down to eat, he asked Uncle Canning about the little girl. Uncle Canning roughly said to my grandfather, "Her father died long ago. The little girl was the only child in the family, so she had to take care of herself since she was small." My grandfather said that the child did very well in school. She walked more than 10 miles to school every day. He wanted to go to her house to see if he could help. Uncle Ken wanted to dissuade my father from going, but he knew that he couldn't stop my grandfather. "Okay, go ahead, but be careful. The road is dangerous." My grandfather prepared everything and set off on the road. Because the mountain road was very dangerous and craggy, the air was cold, so the surrounding became scary. When my grandfather left the house, it was already dark. All the houses around were closed and silent, and there was only the sound of frogs. My grandfather went to the girl's house and helped the family with some chores, and taught her lessons from the days when she didn't go to school. It was completely dark outside then. Everything was in the dark. It was already past 9 o'clock in the evening, and my father had also started to finish work for the day. That little girl and her mother thanked my grandfather because he really helped them a lot too. "You should arrange work and go to school," my grandfather said to the girl and left. When my grandfather walked for a little bit, the girl's mother reminded him not to take the path through the woods, but my grandfather didn't pay much attention to her words. He walked home. The bright moonlight in the sky illuminated the way for him. Walking the forest that night, like this, was very creepy. My grandfather also felt insecure because the mountains and forests were wild. If he was not careful, he could lose his way home at any time. So he started looking at his watch. The watch on his hand showed it was 9:30. If he went on the main road of the village, he would not have time to prepare his lessons for tomorrow when he came home. To save some time to go home earlier, my grandfather chose to take a shortcut into the forest. This shortcut was a direct way home, so it would take less time, of course. No one could know how old the forest was. At night, it was easy to see certain blue flames like flickering ghosts. But my grandpa was not afraid at all. He knew that these blue flames were formed by evaporation of phosphorus from the corpses of people or animals. Not only was he not afraid, but he also found this to be beautiful, because thanks to the blue light, the way home was clearer without fear of getting lost. People in the village rarely dared to walk in the forest. Below the sound of my grandfather's footsteps stepping on branches and leaves. My grandfather walked and made a rustling sound when he walked. Although he was not afraid, he was also very cautious because this forest had quite a lot of poisonous snakes. Because there was not only a rustling sound at my father's feet, but also the sound behind him, he started to feel quite scared. At first, my grandfather just thought that someone was going into the forest looking for something, or an animal was running around and stepping on leaves, so that would make the noise. But when he looked around at the source of the sound, it was clear that he couldn't see anything. Everything fell into silence again. My grandfather said that at that moment he felt a chill in his back. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. It made him shiver. My grandfather started to speed up. He tried to walk faster to get home, but the rustle behind him got louder and louder. Grandpa turned around suddenly because he sensed danger, not simply a noise made by some animal. This thing was much worse. But as soon as my grandfather turned around, he still couldn't see what or who was watching him. The noises were almost gone silent. Grandpa said that he had never been so scared. He knew for sure something was following him. While he was afraid, he also thought of a way to see what was happening. My grandfather carried a small mirror in his briefcase, and he started taking it out. It seemed to be an ordinary mirror, but its use was not to show people. My grandpa used reflections from light to see behind him. Maybe this was a bit silly, but this mirror would help my grandfather know what was following him. This time, Grandpa saw something inside the mirror. His eyes showed panic. His face started to sweat a little. In the mirror, my grandfather saw a very clear image of a child. That child looked blurry and unidentified, standing right behind him. The kid looked monstrous. The hair covered his face to the extent that my grandfather couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but the kid was definitely not that old. Then my grandfather stood still for a few seconds. Right now he seemed to realize something about this child. He must not be an ordinary child at all. My grandfather tried to keep himself as calm as possible, but even he didn't know what to do with himself. Should he run or stay still? And then my grandfather made a decision for himself. He couldn't just stand there waiting for someone to save him. He started running, and as he ran, he felt danger close behind him. He couldn't see it, but he recognized the child with the hair covering the face chasing after him. Grandpa was so afraid that the child would catch up with him and harm him, so he continued to use the mirror to look and see if the child was still behind him. He already knew what this child was, and only by looking in the mirror could one see it. This time, my grandfather saw something more terrifying. The scene before his eyes made him shiver. That was still the same kid, but it looked terrible. The child's hair was blown up by the wind and half of his face was exposed. The other side of his face was completely rotted, looking disgusting. He was extremely scary, and my grandfather was scared, but his mind suddenly became clearer. Then he remembered hitting the gong he was carrying. My grandfather didn't know if the gong would cover his running footsteps or if the echo from the gong would scare the child away. But just like that, my grandfather beat the gong and ran so fast that he didn't dare to stop. In the end, he ran out of the forest anyway. He did not reduce his running speed and continued all the way to Uncle Kang's house, which still had a light. My grandpa was completely exhausted by the time he got home. He could barely breathe. It took a long time for him to regain his strength. Uncle Kang also knew what happened to my grandfather, and he also knew who the child was that my grandfather met in the forest. It was a child who died tragically in the village a few years ago. When the child was 8 years old, he had carelessly played with a horse's tail, and that's when the tragedy happened. As a result, the horse ruffled its hair and panicked because its tail was touched, so it kicked the child's face with its hooves and knocked the kid away. The little girl fell from the air and hit the ground with blood splashing, and half of her face was disfigured, looking very terrible. She died on the spot. Because she was so young, she died instantly. She couldn't enter her ancestors' graves, so she was buried in the forest. Uncle Kang said the child probably just wanted to play with him. She did not want to harm him. My grandfather understood everything. He felt this child was also pitiful, and just because of a little mistake that she had to receive such a tragic death is very sad. After that, every time my grandfather passed through the forest, he no longer felt fear, because he knew that in this forest there was a very good soul. My grandfather used to visit the child's small grave, and then place pure white flowers on top, and that child never followed my grandfather, ever again. There's another creepy story about my grandfather. It happened when he was a teacher in the village. For his convenience, my grandfather rented a place near the school. When he moved moved in, my grandfather asked a close friend to help him move things, and he also met the owner of the house to hand over before leaving. Sorry to bother you, this house is very comfortable, but I need to move closer to the school for easy transportation. My grandfather felt sorry. I understand, it's okay, but the place you moved to, I heard, is not so clean. It used to be cow stables, said Mr. Wong. That was not a problem for my grandfather. The important thing was that it was cheap and close to school. However, at that moment, Mr. Wong's face hardened. He said that the unclean thing he was talking about there was that the house was rumored to be haunted. When my grandfather heard that, he laughed. He didn't care about ghosts because my grandfather also encountered many ghosts before. My grandfather was also curious to ask the landlord what had happened there. So Mr. Wong immediately mentioned a villager named Lu, who was 20 years old but suffered from mental illness and urinary problems. When Lu was only 15 years old and still a normal student, he had a problem with urinating, and he asked permission to go to the toilet. The teacher was a little angry because he was focusing on lecturing but was interrupted by Lu. He shouted to tell him to go quickly and return immediately. He didn't forget to grumble and thought that Lu could only use excuses to ask to go out without studying seriously. Because the way to the toilet was a bit far, by passing an old warehouse, Lu had a fleeting idea. So he went inside the warehouse to deal with his problem. Lu was comfortable peeing because he thought no one would come in. While he was urinating, from behind a scary woman, the coldness emanating from her made him startled. Lu was so scared he fell right into his puddle of urine. He was so scared